It's impossible to understand the full story of what really happened at Louisiana Tech in 1972 without better understanding who Denny Duran was. And in order to understand who Denny Duran was, you have to go back to the beginning. This story actually started 22 years earlier in a small town in Texas called Kilgore, when a young, penniless pastor named Rodney Duran came into town and caught the eye of Francis Elledge, the church's organist. The two fell hopelessly in love and wanted to marry, but there was a problem. The young minister had no money and no way to provide for a wife on the road, much less a family. Among his few possessions was an old car, a working guitar, and a well-worn Bible. To further complicate things, Francis was only 15 years old at the time. By all accounts, such a marriage seemed ill-advised at best, if not doomed before it even began. But the Elledge family sensed a genuine long-term value in the young preacher and gave the couple their blessing anyway. And so they were married on December 7th, 1950, 1 month before her 16th birthday. Of all the covenants the young couple made that fateful day, one promise reigned supreme. For richer or for poorer, in sickness or in health, it didn't matter. Rodney and Francis Duran willingly gave themselves to the Lord and committed to do whatever He required of them for the rest of their lives. And as such faithful servants, as soon as the wedding was over, they got in Rodney's car and headed off towards the town of his next sermon. Only this time, he wouldn't have to preach as a one-man show. As a talented organist and singer, Francis became an integral part of Rodney's services, so much so that he became convinced that the Lord was also calling her into the ministry, a notion that was, for the time period, as unconventional as their wedding was. Francis, however, resisted such promptings. Much of her time instead was spent focusing on surviving, because Rodney's financial situation had not improved, and the couple's sole source of income was completely dependent on the meager offerings of those who would invite them to preach in their churches. Many times, an entire day of serving and preaching would not even yield a few dollars, and the couple had to rely entirely on faith. It was during this particularly difficult crucible, while preaching in nearby Freeport, Texas, that Francis, now 17, gave birth to their first and only child in the small town of Angleton, and named him Denny Duran. The young couple was so destitute that they were unable to adequately feed and clothe the baby. Instead, Francis, having no alternatives, was compelled to wrap the child in blankets as they traveled from town to town, praying that the next congregation would give them enough for some food and maybe perhaps some proper clothes. But this was never a guarantee. Their dire situation lasted for yet another 2 years until finally Francis, certain that she had given all she could, and assuming that God would surely understand, decided to take the young baby and leave Rodney and life on the road as a traveling minister. She went to live with her aunt in Corpus Christi, while Rodney, broken-hearted but undeterred, remained faithful in the ministry and continued on without her. Shortly after her arrival, Frances took a job at a local Sears and tried to start a new life, providing for her baby as a single mom at the age of 19. But then, something unexpected happened. Little Denny, only 2 years old at the time, came down with a burning fever. Frances and her aunt feared it was the dreaded rheumatic fever, but they had no way of knowing because she couldn't afford doctors or medicine. In the early 1950s, before the widespread use of antibiotics to fight strep infections, more than 22,000 children died every year in the United States alone. The reality of a young life being cut short by the dreaded disease was a well-known fear for every mother in America. Frances pled with the Lord night and day to spare her child, but the fever only worsened. Finally, late one night, when she feared the child would not last much longer, she knelt down and promised God that regardless of the outcome, she would return to her husband and the ministry. But then she added, that if God would be so merciful as to let her child live, she would give him back to the Lord for the rest of his life. Within a couple of hours, the fever had broke, and little Denny was again resting like a baby. When the sun rose that morning, Frances was a new woman. She called Rodney and asked him to come and pick her up. She was ready to return for good. It would be the only time, over the next 60 years, that the young lovers who met in Kilgore would ever be apart from each other.